Oh nice! Anbernic just released the RG406V. Well, I guess I should review the RG Cube then. Alright, obviously this video is a bit late, because the internet just moves so fast, especially when it comes to retro handheld emulators like this one, the Anbernic RG Cube, which has been out for a few months, and I've had it for a few months, but it's just taken me some time to get around to making this video. But you know what? I don't super care that it's been out for a few months. It's still a relevant device, if you ask me. If Apple can release an iPhone every year that is barely different from the previous one, I think the RG Cube can be relevant for at least a few months. By the way, thank you to whatgeek.com for sending this RG Cube out for review. They are having their 2-year anniversary event going on right now, which I'll have linked in the description, as well as a coupon code that you can use to pick this up for a bit of a discount. That's going to be code Portly10 for 10% off. They sent me this nice pink metallic looking color, which is called Radiant Purple. I guess it kind of looks like a light purple. Sometimes it looks pink depending on the light, but it's really nice, kind of retro looking. It's got this retro vibe with this color. I don't know, it reminds me of like late 90s game consoles for some reason. It's also available in black, white, and this retro gray color, which almost looks more like a creamy beige with like the Famicom color buttons. It looks cool. When I first saw the RG Cube, I just saw an image of it in passing, and I assumed that it was going to be Anbernic's answer to the Powkiddy RGB30, which at the time was still making its rounds in popularity, mainly due to the 1:1 aspect ratio screen that made this ideal for systems like Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Well, boy howdy was I wrong, because this thing has a lot more to it than the RGB30. I mean, for one, it's an Android device running Android 13. It's got a touchscreen, RGB lights around the thumbsticks, and unlike the RGB30, it can play higher-end systems like PS2, Gamecube, and 3DS. It also runs N64, DS, and PSP much more smoothly than the RGB30. But that boost in performance is also going to come with a boost in price. This thing's available from WhatGeek right now for $209.99 with no games, or you could pay an extra $10 to get a 256GB SD card with over 9,000 games. And since it's an Android device, it also has 120GB of internal storage, so if you don't want to get an SD card and you just want to try to set it up out of the box with the internal storage, it's a little bit limited, but you can do that. Personally, I would just get this thing without the SD card, buy a name brand SD card instead, load up your own ROMs, and start from scratch. But I know that's not something that everybody wants to do, not everybody's willing to do, not everyone is able to do. And so this video is going to focus on what it's like to use this thing as is, out of the box. Now, a few months ago, I reviewed this thing, the Anbernic RG 556. It's a very similar device to the RG Cube, even though it looks very different. That size difference is staunch. Hey look, it's me. Now, the RG 556 shares pretty much the exact same specs with the RG Cube. They both have a Unisoc T8 28-core processor, a quad-core Mali G57 GPU, and 8GB of LPDDR4X RAM. In that RG 556 video, I said it's not really a device that I recommend using as is, and instead going through the process of setting up your own emulators and putting your own ROMs on this thing. That was for a number of reasons. Game Boy Advance Pokemon games could not save. The system was just not set up to let you save Game Boy Advance games without using save states at least. Plus, the emulators pre-installed on the device were not up to date and cannot be updated because they're just kind of, how do I put this? Anbernic put them there and not in a way that is legitimate, I guess you could say. And if you're dropping $200+ on a device like this, you're going to want to play your PS2 games and your Gamecube games, and if you're expecting to have a nice library out of the box, you're going to be disappointed. You had about 17 PS2 games and a total number of 5 GameCube/Wii games. And some of those PS2 games were not even in English, so that was a bit of a road bump for some. 3DS? Sure. But there's no 3DS Pokemon games pre-installed. So, with the RG Cube being so similar to the RG 556, I'm not going to retread a lot of ground that I already covered on the 556 video. You can check that one out separately if you want. Instead, I want to highlight some of the things that make the RG Cube unique, the things that are different from the RG 556, as well as focus on what it's like to use this thing as is, out of the box. Now, just a heads up, this video may sound negative overall by the time it's over, but I don't want to give the impression that the RG Cube is not a good device. As a device overall, I really like the RG Cube. Let me just get that out there right now. The screen looks great. It's a 720p 3.95-inch IPS display with a 1:1 aspect ratio, and it looks fantastic. For a lot of retro games that have a native aspect ratio closer to 1:1 or 4:3, etc., games are going to look great. The RGB lighting around the thumbsticks adds a nice touch, much nicer than the white LED rings on the RG556. You can even choose from other colors and effects if you want, and if you don't want to use those, that's fine, you can just turn them off. The buttons feel very nice and responsive, tactile without being too clicky and without being too firm. They feel good. The D-pad is nice, and it's actually very different from the one on the RG556. It's a more rounded 8-directional D-pad, so if you're into fighting games and you like to use the D-pad for those, this is going to feel great for pulling off those quarter circles, diagonals, and so on. However, that does make it a little more prone to accidental diagonals, so there's that. You've got down-firing speakers on the bottom. They sound good to my ears, but if you're completely opposed to down-firing speakers for whatever reason, you do have a headphone jack along the top, and it is also an Android device, so you've got Bluetooth if you want to use that. There's also a heat vent along the top and a fan on the back. So far I haven't noticed any fan noise. This thing can get a bit warmer with some of the higher-end games if you're playing for a while, so assuming the fan is kicking in and doing its job, the lack of fan noise so far is nice. One downside as far as the overall design of this thing is that it's just not all that comfortable, at least compared to the RG556. That thing was one of the most comfortable handheld devices I have ever used, ever. The RG Cube, much less so. It's still comfortable, but it's just noticeably less. There's still plenty of finger groove space to get all situated back there. So, with that all said, what is it like to use the RG Cube out of the box? Well, I would say it depends. It depends on what kind of games you're trying to play, and what your expectations are for a device in this price range. After your initial setup, you can press the R button on the left here to bring up Anbernic's built-in front end, and here you can browse through each of the different systems that has games installed. Some have hundreds of games, while others have significantly fewer. By the way, if this default theme doesn't tickle your fancy, you can also change the theme if you like. There's a couple to choose from. Now, the game selection is going to vary and be pretty hit and miss. Super Nintendo has a ton of games, but a lot of them, and I mean a lot of them, are Japanese games, many of which I don't even recognize the names of. Most of them don't have screenshots or box art, so you kind of have to go into each one to see what it is and see if it's something that you can play. Don't get me wrong, Japanese games are great, but if it's an RPG that you need to read throughout and you can't read it, what's really the point of having it on the device? There may also be multiples of some games. It is very common when devices are set up like this. And this is the case throughout most of the systems that have lots of games listed. Your best bet if you want to play a specific game is to press the start button and bring up the search. Unfortunately, a lot of great games are missing here, which makes it a little more disappointing that so many Japanese games are loaded instead of stuff like, I don't know, Skyblazer, Sparkster. That might be because I have the 128GB SD card, which as far as I can tell is not available on WhatGeek anymore. You can only get no games or the 256GB card. My assumption is because I have the 128GB card, it cuts off the game selection at a certain point, because I've noticed that the Super Nintendo list, for example, just stops at R and it doesn't go anywhere beyond that. So that's why Skyblazer and Sparkster specifically are missing. You're also not going to find any games with a certain plumber's name in the title, but that's just something that Anbernic has done on all their handhelds for at least a couple of years. And because I always go through them, here is what you can expect if you want to catch them all. The selection pretty much ends with Game Boy Advance. DS and 3DS is a no-go. But you've got plenty of bootleg NES platformers if you want that. I mean, hey, who among us doesn't love the all-time classic Pokemon 2000? I know I don't. For higher end systems, PS2 does have a decent but limited selection, only 17 games, and really it's only 15 because the bottom two are like BIOS things. God of War 2 is a classic, and Devil May Cry as well. Except Devil May Cry appears to be maybe the Asian English international version or something. The voice acting is all in English, but the text is in this language, which I cannot read. You can probably go into the options to change it to English, but I can't read it, so I can't figure out how to do that. You've also got Resident Evil 4. It's not the GameCube version, but it's still nice to have. GameCube/Wii is significantly less, again capping out at 5 games, 2 of which are Zelda, so I mean that's a win. One downside that I'm noticing is with some of these higher end systems, when you're playing 3D games where the action on screen is a lot smaller, it is so much harder to see what is going on this screen compared to the RG556. It's not a huge device. It's probably around the same size as a Nintendo Switch Lite, but that screen is just noticeably bigger than what you're limited to on the RG Cube, especially because the aspect ratio kind of cuts things off a bit with the RG Cube, so you're not even using the full screen when you're playing some of these higher end games. Now, performance is where I was pleasantly surprised and also a little confused. Out of the box, the RG556 had trouble running Wind Waker from what I remember. It wasn't until I went through all this setup that it actually ran pretty normal. On the RG Cube, it seems to run just fine, at least from the testing I've done so far. Same for Twilight Princess. PS2 had a much harder time on the RG 556 even after downloading an updated emulator, with me always needing to change settings for each game, and it was just a whole process. But here, I haven't had to change any settings, and all the games that I've tested on PS2 ran smoothly. This is very confusing because, as I said earlier, these devices have the exact same specs, and they both came out this year. I'm assuming it has something to do with maybe the optimization. They've updated some things since the RG 556. I don't know. I'm not complaining, it's just, I don't get it. 3DS is where the limitations start to kick in. Kirby Triple Deluxe had some pretty bad frame rate issues just at the main menu. Ocarina of Time 3D seems to run a bit better. I'm assuming it's a little less demanding than Triple Deluxe. Now if you swipe down twice from the top of the screen and then over to this CPU icon, if you tap that to turn on high mode, I find this does help with performance on 3DS games or maybe any higher end games that you might have trouble running. It's still far from perfect, but it's better. This will come at the cost of battery life though. Speaking of battery life, this does have a 5200 mAh battery, which Anbernic says should give you about 7 hours of battery life. Now obviously this is going to vary depending on what kinds of games you're playing, if you have the high CPU mode on, if you have the RGB rings on. I imagine 7 hours is probably closer to what you get if you have all that stuff off and you're playing like Game Boy, Super Nintendo, etc. If you're going to be playing Gamecube, you probably get maybe half that time. I'm assuming. I don't play these games long enough to really give you an extensive battery test, but just to let you know, just because it says 7 hours on Anbernic's website, don't always expect 7 hours. So yeah, overall, mixed feelings when it comes to using the RG Cube out of the box. Is this going to be the right device for you? Only you can really know that. For lower end systems, there are so many great options for less than half the cost of this thing that if you're mainly going to be playing those types of systems, I really can't recommend a device like this. But it's your money, you can do with it what you want with it. For higher end systems, the selection here is so limited that it's also hard to recommend if you are not planning to add your own ROMs. But I would say that if you do have the means to add your own ROMs, with the performance I was getting for PS2 and GameCube, you could honestly probably get away with just using these stock built-in emulators and adding your own ROMs. You will have to delete some games to make some space though, because this thing is loaded up when you get it, and those higher end games are pretty beefy. And for 3DS, I mean honestly, if that's the main system you're trying to emulate, you're not going to find a better system to emulate 3DS than a 3DS. You can mod it very easily, and it's just great. I mean, look into it, look into HShop, it's great. And that is my experience using the RG Cube as is, fresh out the box, straight into my hands, straight into your eyes if you've watched this video. And if you watched it this far, well, thank you very much for watching. I appreciate you, and I appreciate if you would like to watch more videos, and subscribe to this channel if you're new. Leave a like if you like this video, dislike it if you didn't. Leave a comment, kindly letting me know one way or the other if you did or didn't. What do you think of the RG Cube? Is it something you plan to pick up? Is there a better device out there in this price range? But if you don't plan to pick this up and you want to support the channel for free, again, just like, comment, subscribe, share this video with a friend, share the channel with a friend, share it with your grandma, and tell her, hey grandma, here's that guy I told you about, the one that looks like that dude on that TV show. If it's not apparent, I scripted most of this video except the ending. And yeah, here we are, this is what happens.